Andrew Jackson has been called many things. Strong-willed and combative, a man of the people, and a demagogue. The seventh president was the orphaned son of impoverished immigrants who rose to become an aristocrat of the American South. A man who, despite his tall stature, dealt with numerous physical frailties that would leave him in immense pain over the course of his lifetime. A man whose reputation for violence and dramatics often overshadow his singular legal mind and political cunning. The true insanity of Andrew Jackson lies not in the terrifying picture of him we often imagine, a picture that doesn't cease to reflect his life, but in the unlikelihood of his story, the fact that this man, full of so much complexity and contradiction, ever rose to become president of the United States, a champion of the common man who kept people in chains, who fought for personal freedoms while driving hundreds from their homes, and who nevertheless expanded American democracy more than any other president who came before him. Our modern portraits of Jackson too often fall short of the paradox that was this peculiar man. Someone who met Jackson in person wouldn't have encountered some backwards frontiersman, but instead a Southern gentleman and calculating politician, who fought against financial hierarchy while simultaneously fighting to maintain a racial one. Jackson was in many ways the first populist president, the pioneer of an anti-elite politics, whose foundation would be built upon by figures as wide-ranging as William Jennings Bryan and Huey Long, to even Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. In our modern era of self-proclaimed anti-establishment figures, we look towards Jackson as the original, the prototype for all that would follow. An early adopter of the politics of resentment, as later used by figures such as Nixon and Reagan. To better understand Jackson's world, I went all the way to his home, the Hermitage in Nashville, Tennessee. The seventh president was our first chief executive that didn't hail from Virginia or Massachusetts. No, Jackson was born in the Waxhaw settlement on the western frontier of the Carolinas. And his early life would be defined by the struggles and hardship of that rugged frontier we so often romanticize. Jackson's parents ventured to the colonies in 1765, joining a wave of Scots-Irish immigrants whose independent and adventurous natures would paint the character of the American frontier. Jackson never met his father, who died before the future president was even born, the first in the family to fall to the brutal frontier. The widowed Elizabeth would take her young boys to live with her sister's family, the Crawfords. Jackson may have felt self-conscious as the youngest of a large band of brothers and cousins all growing up in the same household. One could easily read that Jackson's ability to assert himself came as a necessity under these circumstances. Someone who grew up with Jackson described him as the only bully he ever knew that wasn't a coward. A way for this fatherless little boy to overcome his disadvantages, constantly looking for ways to compete with older boys physically. The early life of this fatherless child of immigrants growing up in the farthest edge of Western settlement couldn't have drawn a starker contrast to that of the presidents of the founding generation who came before him. But the decisions of that group of overwhelmingly aristocratic and privileged men who would become our founding fathers would play a critical yet tragic role in the life of a poor young boy far away from their Enlightenment ideas of governance, who would pay the true price of the American Revolution. At just 13 years old, Jackson joined his two older brothers in volunteering for the revolutionary cause. For young men of low birth, war can seem like an opportunity for advancement, a shot at escape, at glory for those who have nothing. War more often, in reality, means pain and suffering. The brutality of that great American frontier extended to and was amplified by its Revolutionary War campaigns. For young Andrew Jackson, the battlefield would eventually bring glory beyond his wildest imagination, but for now, all that it brought was the total destruction of everything that he held dear. Jackson's oldest brother, Hugh, died of a heat stroke following a battle in 1779. Just 2 years later, the adolescent Jackson and his brother Robert were captured by the British. As a prisoner of war, the future president was slashed by the sword of an officer for refusing to shine his shoes. The rebellious defiance of authority and volatile temper that would define his public persona being forged in real time. A glimpse of the man that he would become. The dire conditions of frontier life seem insurmountable today, let alone treatment of a frontier prisoner. Illness was in the air, death and infection around every corner, creeping into the lungs of this boy who would become president. Andrew and Robert both contracted smallpox. Both came to death's door. Both were given freedom in a prisoner exchange organized by their mother. But only Andrew would live long enough to be truly free. Remarkably, to this day, Andrew Jackson is the only prisoner of war to ever become president of the United States. While Elizabeth Jackson could only save one of her little boys from the horrors of war, she saved many sons of other mothers, desperate to see their boys survive, as a nurse in Charleston following Andrew's recovery. But in a cruel twist of fate, she would contract cholera and die shortly after.
Jackson was simultaneously a veteran of our founding revolution and a 15-year-old orphan. We too often think of these figures as paintings, of their triumphs and tragedies as something simply written in a history book. We know that they happened, but do we really stop to consider them in the full scope of human emotion? How we would feel if this happened to us today? I stand in front of this mansion today for a reason, to illustrate the contrast between the pain and suffering of Jackson's early life with the heights that he would eventually claw his way up to. We note Jackson's story for the remarkable nature of his unlikely life, for his ability to rise above his circumstances and change the face of this great nation. But what about the ones that didn't make it to the Hermitage? The Hughes, the Roberts, the Elizabeths. Just as human as you and I, just as complex as you and I, but despite their best efforts, still casualties of history. The path to power of this 15-year-old orphan to the presidency is perhaps the most unlikely of any of this nation's chief executives. So how did the madman do it?
The Revolutionary War would give Jackson a lifelong enemy in the British, a symbol of tyranny of the monarchy and the highborn elite in the mind of a boy, forming a worldview amidst the tragedy that surrounded him. Though it is also crucial to consider Jackson's lineage. The plight of the Scots-Irish who struggled against the British crown, a struggle that drove his family across the Atlantic, but somehow managed to follow them into the New World. The father Jackson had never met, the mother and brothers that were taken from him by the war. In the absence of family, country became kin. The death of everyone that the young Jackson held dear coincided with the birth of the nation that would define his life. Shortly after Elizabeth's death, Andrew left the Crawfords and the Waxhaws forever. Perhaps he let his temper get the best of him during a heated argument, or he just wanted to get away from the painful memories. Through it all, this boy that was surrounded by death acted as though he were indestructible. Perhaps this clearly intelligent young man felt he was destined for greater things beyond the common apprenticeship he was undertaking under his uncle. Jackson would repeatedly express his disdain for working common trades as a young man as he bounced around the southern colonies.
In 1784, a 17-year-old Jackson decided to study the law. Here, he put the full scope of his personality to work. The charisma, the temper, the wild nature. that we so closely associate with Jackson today. A glimpse into the eccentric yet charismatic man that he would become. His career trajectory would push him even further into the frontier, across the Allegheny Mountains to here in Nashville, where he would build his name.
Here, Jackson would meet a young woman named Rachel Donaldson while boarding at her mother's house. Rachel had been married previously to an abusive husband from whom she was estranged. This made her the rare divorcee and one whose separation had been done with questionable legality. She was also the daughter of one of Nashville's founding families, which carried considerable political weight. Andrew's marriage to Rachel would help solidify his social position, but it would also be a source of attacks and criticism for the duration of their public life together. The exact timing of Rachel's divorce and new marriage were subject to a lot of scrutiny. It turns out the divorce had never been properly finalized, and only some years later was Rachel's first husband able to be granted a divorce based off of the supposed infidelity. The Jacksons then had to remarry for their union to be legally valid. As Jackson became a nationally venerated hero, his complicated marriage drew accusations of bigamy, which would weigh heavily on the couple, especially during his later presidential campaigns. While the Jacksons never had any biological children of their own, they did raise a band of various children in need of a home. Many have speculated that Jackson's own experience as an orphan may have informed his willingness to take in those with nowhere else to go. Jackson's westward journey into Nashville proved to be a formative experience for the young man, just as it would be for countless settlers making further inroads into the continent, away from the coastal colonies of their forefathers and into the ever-romanticized frontier. But there was nothing romantic about it in the moment. It was a dangerous and perilous journey. It's here in Nashville that Jackson would develop his tense relationship with Native Americans, a testament to the strength of his newfound identity as a Westerner. As Tennessee was admitted into the Union, the orphan soldier who had risen up the ranks of polite society made his way to the nation's capital, Philadelphia, as the state's first member of Congress. Here, Jackson criticized Washington for his executive overreach, something that Jackson himself would be accused of during his own presidency later on. For as fiery of a figure as Jackson was, he left little impression in the lower house of Congress, being frustrated with its monotonous procedures. Jackson was even less suited for the United States Senate, whose slow deliberation would come into conflict with the future president's temperament. Jackson felt out of place among these high-born, well-educated men who he felt looked down on him. After his short stint in Congress, he headed back west in search of another post to satisfy his growing ambitions. Jackson would gain his prominence not at the nation's capital, but on the battlefields that better reflected his nature. During his time as Major General of the Tennessee State Militia, Jackson had a connection with the disgraced former Vice President Aaron Burr, which would become a source of criticism for Jackson following Burr's bizarre attempt to conquer the Western territories.
There's an ironic similarity between these two men, given what Burr is most famous for.
To understand Jackson's apparent eagerness to engage in duels, it's important to understand what duels really represented. They weren't intended to kill, but instead to demand satisfaction, defending your honor against someone who may have wronged it. It was a gentlemanly practice, a formality reserved for the nobility of the day. Nobility that was far from Jackson's upbringing and that he felt particularly vulnerable in. Just as he may have become rowdy, headstrong, and defiant in the Crawford household as a way to assert himself over the other young boys, he continued to employ those personality traits to secure his tenuous social standing.
For this reason, Jackson wouldn't engage in duels with anyone below his social standing, as they couldn't challenge his honor in any meaningful way. If he was disrespected by a man he considered unworthy of a duel, he might beat the man up with his bare hands or even with his cane, depending on the occasion. The idea that Jackson participated in nearly 100 duels throughout his life is greatly exaggerated. Jackson engaged in many acts of violence throughout his time on this earth, but this number seems to have come as a result of that reputation and not of any historical evidence. But we can learn a lot from the duels Jackson did actually engage in.
One of these was with John Sevier, a man who seems quite similar to Jackson despite their differences. Another young man without means, born into one of the 13 colonies, who fought in the Revolution and made his way westward to the frontier that would become Tennessee in search of opportunity, where he would rise above his social standing and become one of the state's founding fathers, serving as their first governor. Despite their similarities, or perhaps because of them, Jackson and Sevier were political rivals. Their list of grievances with one another throughout their careers is frankly too long to list in its entirety. In 1802, while Sevier was the sitting governor, him and the future president had an altercation in which Sevier accused the Jacksons of adultery because of Rachel's complicated divorce. Jackson was enraged, and he would challenge the most powerful man in his state to a duel. This had the danger of being another Hamilton and Burr, two prominent politicians fighting to the death to the detriment of their families and constituents. Though the duel proceeded, luckily no blood was shed, and it ended in a draw. The two men were even able to become friends afterwards, which frankly isn't too surprising given their similar backgrounds. The 1806 contest between Andrew Jackson and Charles Dickinson came as the previous duel had, as a result of a long list of grievances, in this case largely involving something as petty as horse racing, and of course attacks on Rachel Jackson's supposed bigamy. Aware of Dickinson's reputation for marksmanship, the tall, thin Jackson wore an oversized coat which widened his frame as to trick his opponent into missing the heart. Dickinson fired first, and Jackson was hit just a few inches away from his heart, breaking his rib. The slight deviation of that one bullet could have changed American history as we know it. Jackson covered his wound with his hand to stop the bleeding, held himself up as steady as he possibly could, and fired back. Jackson hit Dickinson in the abdomen, a wound that would prove to become fatal. The future president of the United States had just killed a man, very publicly. While Jackson would be criticized for doing this during his presidential campaigns, much more of an issue would be made of his wife's marital status than the murder he committed. Perhaps the greatest consequence for Jackson would be physical. The bullet was too close to his heart to be removed, and Jackson would live with it there for the rest of his life. Ironically, this duel marks the rough halfway point of Jackson's long and storied life. The 39-year-old future president would live another 39 years in which he would suffer from terrible chronic pain from the bullet lodged in his chest, yet another battle scar to accompany the gash across his face from his childhood. The idea of Jackson the dueler, the brawler, the warrior coincides with three core aspects of his background: Jackson the frontiersman, Jackson the Scots-Irish immigrant, and Jackson the common man. All three of which were inextricably linked to his violent image, an image that would serve him politically. Jackson's military career could be a long and complicated video in its own right, but this project is more focused on Jackson the human being, the image he cultivated, and the ways in which he changed our politics. For this reason, I won't be looking too in-depth into his war record, instead analyzing what it meant in the broader story of his life. Jackson served as the Major General of the Tennessee State Militia during the Creek War, a conflict that resulted from white settlement on native land, a subject that will only become more relevant to Jackson as the story unfolds. His success on this front saw him rise to the position of Major General of the U.S. Army. When talking about Jackson, it is inevitable to draw parallels between him and George Washington. Both were great military generals whose tall statures made them even more commanding figures. But Jackson's victory in the Battle of New Orleans against the British in the War of 1812 truly made him akin to a second George Washington. The great leader who finished the first president's political project by at last freeing us from the British for all time. A biography of General Jackson written by his aides after the war would spread his legend throughout the country, making him even more famous, while also making his life story an integral part of his political identity.
Jackson's last great military exploit would come in 1818, and it would be as daring as it was illegal. The Seminole tribe of northern Florida had often been encouraged by the British to attack American settlements above the Florida border, creating a problem for a nation that was seeking to further encroach on native lands. The Seminole tribe also provided a safe haven for many escaped slaves, which deeply angered Southern slave owners. What exactly happened next is unclear, but it would lead to the First Seminole War. Jackson's orders were to defend the borders of the United States, not to expand them. Florida was still under Spanish rule at the time, despite American pressure for them to sell the land, so we had no right to invade it, and doing so would be an act of war against Spain. General Jackson claimed that he had informed President James Monroe of his intention to seize Spanish forts and had gotten his explicit permission to do so. But there's no evidence that this permission was actually granted. What exactly happened in the permission structure is still greatly debated to this day, but one thing is clear. There was no declaration of war, and Jackson's seizing of a Spanish fort was unprecedented action for a military general, constitutionally dubious at best and outright disobeying orders at worst, potentially getting the United States into yet another war for territory. Many, including Jackson's future vice president, John C. Calhoun, thought this was egregious and wanted to see Jackson punished. But for all of his recklessness, Jackson had advanced American interests. The United States was in control of much of northwestern Florida, and Spain's negotiating position had been greatly weakened. Jackson was also extraordinarily popular. The great general's heroic actions made him a political force in his own right, and any sort of punishment of his daring exploits would have come with considerable political consequences. Jackson would be fully exonerated for his actions and be appointed as the first military governor of Florida. If Jackson was truly becoming the second George Washington, was it too late to stop his ascent?
The presidential election of 1824 saw an illustrious lineup of candidates vying for the nation's highest office. The Democratic-Republican Party had been the dominant force in American politics since the election of Thomas Jefferson almost a quarter century earlier. Now, 4 separate Democratic-Republican candidates ran for the presidency. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, the accomplished son of the nation's second president, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, one of the most respected statesmen of his era, Treasury Secretary William Crawford, another accomplished politician in his own right, and the comparatively inexperienced war hero Andrew Jackson, who carried the support of the common man. For the impoverished orphan to have risen so far above his station that he was competing for the nation's highest office against these men of privilege, the creatures of the establishment he had always rallied against, was extraordinary. There wasn't much disagreement among these 4 men who all belonged to the same party. So this election really became about personality and regional alliance. An unprecedented amount of white men made their way to the ballot box as the property ownership requirement loosened, setting the stage for a potential Jackson upset. All of these factors culminated in one of the most insane election outcomes in the history of this country. Jackson, the man who had clawed his way up the ladder of polite society, overcame the odds, winning 99 electoral votes, the most out of any of the candidates. Here he had done it. He had finally beaten the establishment. Or had he? See, Jackson won the most votes out of any candidate, but he fell short of the 131 vote majority needed to win the election. This meant that the House of Representatives would decide who won the election out of the top 3 candidates. This excluded Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who had come in 4th. But Clay would use his considerable influence in the chamber to sway votes away from Jackson, who he despised. In Jackson's view, here was the Washington machine trying to strip him of his rightful victory. The people had spoken, and the politicians hadn't listened. John Quincy Adams would become the 6th president of the United States, the first in American history to be elected without winning the popular vote. To Jackson, the House of Representatives handed the office to this bureaucrat whose daddy had been president. He and his supporters were furious, alleging a corrupt bargain between Clay and Adams, where the prospective president would appoint Clay to be his Secretary of State in exchange for his sway in the House. Adams was the 4th president in a row to have previously served as head of the State Department, and the appointment would serve as a stepping stone on Clay's own ascent to the presidency later on. As Clay indeed became Adams' Secretary of State, these accusations would plague the new administration. Folks in our day and age should be familiar with the idea of a shadow presidency. Following his loss in the 2020 election, Donald Trump was already the clear frontrunner for his party's nomination the next time around. He was an ever-present force criticizing the president who had defeated him and galvanizing his base in the run-up to an apparent rematch that would correct the record. That isn't too different from what Jackson did during the Adams administration. His supporters saw the House's interference as an affront to democracy, an undermining of the will of the people. Consequently, Jackson supporters started calling themselves Democrats. To talk about the ways in which Jackson still impacts the presidency and populism to this day, I've gotten the help of my friend Ryan Geddie.
Hi, I'm Ryan, and that's a great question, Andre. What does it mean to be a populist? A dictionary might tell you that a populist politician is one who claims to represent the interests of the common people against an elite or an establishment. But if you're anything like me, this definition might leave you feeling a little confused. What kind of politician trying to win an election in a democratic society would intentionally portray themselves as being against the interests of the common person? And what about populist movements in the past like Jackson's that clearly did not, in fact, represent the interests of all common people? To make this more clear and to understand why some politicians are considered to be more populist than others, we need to dig into that definition a little more. The first part of the definition is that a populist must claim to represent the common people. This is the part of the definition that applies pretty strongly to most politicians. But a populist must also present their championing of the common people as part of a struggle against an elite or an establishment. Populism isn't exclusive to any particular political ideology, and you can actually learn a lot about the actual ideology of a particular populist by paying attention to how they define the common people and the elite or the establishment. You may notice that how a politician chooses to present themselves is an essential part of what makes a politician a populist or not. A politician may advocate for policies that they believe would in fact help the common people at the expense of an elite or an establishment without being a populist. Just for example, a tax hike on high-income earners could either be framed as a way to reduce the deficit while maintaining a strong social safety net, or as a way to make the rich who profit off of the work of average people pay their fair share to society. These are two framings of the exact same policy, but the second framing is clearly more populist than the first framing.
Thank you, Ryan.
Don't forget to check out the collaboration we just did over on Ryan's channel on how politicians can influence public opinion.
Or else you'll find yourself on the wrong end of Andrew Jackson's cane. Adams signed the Tariff of 1828, which came to be known as the Tariff of Abominations for its disproportionate impact on southern states, which would bolster Jackson's support in the South, drawing the election even clearer along regional lines. And that's the last time we ever saw a North-South divide in American history. Jackson was heavily criticized for being a slave owner, for his brutality with Native Americans, and for his participation in duels. Arguments that we are very sympathetic to today, but Adams supporters also made an issue of Jackson's marriage, with accusations of adultery and bigamy burdening the couple all throughout the campaign. Despite all of the attacks, and perhaps to an extent because of them, Andrew Jackson was elected the 7th president of the United States, winning all but 3 states in the entire Union. This election was a remarkable turning point in American history, the birth of Jacksonian democracy. The 7th president would, in many ways, be an heir to Thomas Jefferson. Jeffersonian democracy had sought to empower white men that owned property, It was thought that these men would be the masters of their own destinies, free from the constraints of wages and markets. Jacksonian democracy, on the other hand, sought to empower all white men, regardless of social status. The presidents of the founding generation had all been wealthy men from within the political system, all either Virginia planters or members of the Adams political family. Andrew Jackson was the first of a new generation of American president, one that better reflected the average citizen. You don't get Lincoln's log cabin without Jackson's ascent to the presidency. The election of 1828 also saw the dawn of the second party system, where the Democratic and Whig parties would come to prominence with Jackson at the center of their divide. Because of the vicious remarks aimed at her throughout the campaign, Rachel Jackson would say she would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that palace in Washington. Rachel had suffered from health issues for a long time, and it seemed that the stress of the campaign worsened her condition. On December 22, 1828, shortly after her husband was elected president of the United States, Rachel would die suddenly from a heart attack. This was supposed to be Jackson's moment of triumph. That boy who had been left alone in the world doing the impossible, defeating the establishment that had robbed him. But as his beloved Rachel died, he was orphaned all over again, left alone in the world all over again. Jackson lashes out, blaming the death of his wife on all of the hateful rhetoric that came from his opponents. He truly believed until his dying day that they had killed the woman he loved. Rachel was laid to rest at the Hermitage in the white gown she had saved for her husband's inauguration. As Andrew Jackson took the oath of office, surrounded by a rowdy mob, unable to contain their excitement, people who had traveled from far and wide to see the great hero of the common man take his rightful place as President of the United States, he spoke solemnly in dark mourning dress at what was meant to be his greatest triumph without the woman who had gotten him there. Andrew Jackson was the president, but it wasn't clear exactly what he was going to do. He promised to deliver reform, but what exactly would that entail? The new president sought to remake the federal bureaucracy in his image, purging high-ranking federal employees he claimed had been corrupted within the system. Ever the champion of the common man, he argued that regular folk should be given the opportunity to hold these positions. In reality, Jackson installed his allies and political supporters to positions they were often unqualified for. This wasn't anything new. People had given positions as political favors for a long time. But under Jackson, it drew heavy criticism and became known as the spoils system. The Whigs opposed Jackson's agenda and painted him as a tyrannical king.
It's important to note that the only two Whigs to ever win presidential elections were, like Jackson, war heroes.
Many today lament how 24-hour news networks and social media have turned the presidency into a game of celebrity, but there's a precedent for that throughout all of American history.
Jefferson and Jackson's conception of the self-sufficient landowner who creates his own wealth without depending on the financial system is inherently flawed. The lifestyle of the Southern planters who saw themselves reflected in our nation's earliest presidents was entirely dependent on the labor of enslaved people. While we cannot judge figures of the past by the morality of today, that doesn't make the human suffering that men like Jackson caused any less real. Exploring the grounds of the Hermitage, I could vividly picture the people that Jackson enslaved, walking and working the land. The seventh president would come to own 300 human beings over the course of his lifetime, a staggering number that would work his fields and act as servants in his home. Jackson's brutality and other aspects of his life certainly translated to his relationship with his slaves, and he is widely regarded to have treated them quite brutally, even for the period. Jackson is perhaps best known for his 1830 signing of the Indian Removal Act, without a doubt one of the worst laws in American history. When people speak of Jackson's cruelty, this is often what they have in mind. This law gave the president the authority to sign treaties with native tribes in the effort of pushing them from the eastern side of the country in which they had lived for generations into the less desirable land west of the Mississippi, which led to the forced displacement of nearly 50,000 human beings that just happened to be in the way of American expansion. The infamous Trail of Tears forced 16,000 Cherokee, who had historically inhabited the southeastern United States, to walk nearly 1,000 miles through the fall and harsh winter. 4,000 Cherokee would tragically die during this terrible journey, around 1/5 of their total population. By the time that the Trail of Tears happened, Jackson was out of the presidency, but he laid the groundwork for this horrendous crime. A significant portion of the 25 million acres of land that the government had taken would be used to expand slavery in the American South, combining the two most terrible aspects of Jackson's legacy into one. The Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia, ruled that states had no jurisdiction over Native American lands. This is where we find the famous statement, which, while likely apocryphal, serves to illustrate Jackson's attitudes towards the decision. In talking about the Chief Justice, Jackson supposedly stated, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The Jackson administration and the state of Georgia both decided to just ignore the decision. Here was the President of the United States blatantly defying a Supreme Court order. Jackson's willingness to completely disregard the ruling would make another one of the most consequential moments of his presidency even more confusing.
Jackson was a strong believer in states' rights. He favored individual freedoms and limiting the power of federal government. This makes what happened during the Nullification Crisis even more remarkable. South Carolina sought to nullify a national tariff that it felt was unfairly impacting its economy. There was even some talk of secession. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution states that when federal and state laws are in conflict, the national law holds precedence, but what was on paper would have mattered little without federal government action. Andrew Jackson, who himself favored a small central government, saw that this could set a dangerous precedent. He then raises an army to compel South Carolina to drop its nullification of the tariff.
His vice president, John C. Calhoun, who hails from South Carolina, is furious and resigns his office to go represent his state in the Senate in this time of crisis. The same president that defied the court's ruling stepped up to assert federal power over the states where few would have expected him to. In January of 1835, Jackson was just outside the Capitol building attending a funeral when a man named Richard Lawrence stepped out from behind a pillar and aimed point blank for Jackson's heart. Dust and smoke filled the air as Lawrence's weapon misfired. The crazed assassin pulled out another gun, once again firing at the commander-in-chief, and once again his weapon failed him. This was incredible luck for the president whose ailing health had left him dependent on a cane to help him get around. This man, who had avoided death countless times, had once again walked away unharmed. As they say, if you come for the king, you better not miss. At times, Jackson's violence can be greatly exaggerated. This was not one of those times. The furious president proceeded to beat his would-be assassin mercilessly with his cane. There were accusations of a conspiracy surrounding this incident, but in reality, Lawrence was just insane. Ironically enough, just 30 days prior to the assassination attempt, Senator Calhoun had said Jackson was a Caesar who ought to have a Brutus. This reflects Jackson as a man who, for all his libertarian philosophies, did have some authoritarian tendencies. Even with all of these contradictions, Jackson remained deeply suspicious of centralized power, especially in regards to financial institutions. George Washington and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton had established a national bank that would issue currency and provide financial services for government business. Thomas Jefferson had been opposed to this idea as it favored commerce and industry in a way that would undermine the agrarian society he had envisioned. Jefferson may have lost the battle then, but Jackson, as his ideological successor, would go to war against the banks during his presidency. To Jackson, the national bank symbolized the power of business and the wealthy elite. It favored manufacturing and industry of the northern states over the agrarian economies of the South and the frontier that had made Jackson a very rich man himself. In 1832, in the midst of Jackson's re-election campaign, he vetoed the new charter for the Second National Bank, turning its future into one of the most contested issues of the campaign. Once Jackson was re-elected and the Whigs suffered a bad midterm defeat 2 years later, the president had the political capital to close the bank for good, redistributing its funds to smaller state banks and letting its charter expire in 1836. The United States would then go up until 1913 without a central banking system, perhaps the greatest victory of Jackson's ideological project.
The term president simply refers to someone who presides, a soft guiding hand far removed from the daily lives of its citizens, in stark contrast to the imperial presidency of the modern day, where the commander-in-chief is the single most powerful person on the face of the earth. The story of the American presidency is the story of an office dramatically changing and expanding in ways that many of the men who had held that office previously could never have conceived of. George Washington, a man to whom Andrew Jackson is often compared, even by his contemporaries, a comparison that I myself drew earlier in this video, is also immeasurably different from Jackson in some very important aspects. The presidency of George Washington was defined by his restraint and neutrality. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, relished in the political mud that Washington sought to stay above. If the first president established the role as that of a protector, Andrew Jackson transformed it into that of a liberator. The contradictions in Jackson's actions and worldview could be understood through the lens of an ambitious man who often acted in self-interest. Despite being a remarkable politician, he was a poor legislator because he wasn't suited for the role or even really interested in it. General Jackson appreciated the hierarchy and chain of command of both the military and the executive branch. Outside interference, whether it be from Congress or from the courts, ran contrary to Jackson's philosophy. He advocated for both a strong presidency and a strong state government simultaneously. Strong executives at both levels. Ironically enough, this advocate of states' rights greatly increases executive power, and along with it, the tensions between the federal and state governments in the lead up to the Civil War. And Jackson's expansion of presidential powers is what allows Lincoln to be as powerful as he was. In keeping South Carolina at bay during the Nullification Crisis, he had protected the northern industry he had rallied against his entire career. And in doing so, he set the stage for the expanded use of presidential power Lincoln would use during the Civil War. The great emancipator was able to use that precedent Jackson established to say no, the state cannot simply secede from the Union, and it is within a president's authority to raise an army to prevent that from happening. Washington condemned political parties, but both Jackson and Lincoln ushered them in, each being the first chief executive elected within the two major parties we still find ourselves with today. They were far more modern presidents in the scope of their ambition. The legacy of Andrew Jackson is a complicated one. During the New Deal, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. writes this Pulitzer Prize-winning history titled The Age of Jackson, which chronicles the life of the seventh president from the perspective of someone living through the New Deal. Here, he draws parallels between Jackson, the great Democrat of 1830s, with Roosevelt, the great Democrat of the 1930s, continuing that tradition 100 years later. Contrary to our popular perception of Old Hickory, Schlesinger frames Jackson as the precedent for the New Deal,
taking on the financial interests in the bank just as Roosevelt did.
It venerated him as one of the great liberal icons of American history, but that veneration wouldn't last. Jackson's accurate reputation of owning slaves and expelling the Indians significantly hurt his standing in the eyes of the Democratic Party following the Civil Rights Movement. Though he wasn't the only president with these stains on his legacy, he became a symbol of these terrible things he was indeed guilty of. Washington and Jefferson pioneered democracy in their own rights, but they were venerated among men. Washington, the great war hero of the Revolution, and Jefferson, the great intellect behind the Declaration of Independence. Jackson, on the other hand, managed to strike a balance between a heroic reputation and plain-spoken approachability that made him seem more of the masses than above them. Jackson lived at the Hermitage from 1804 up until his death in 1845. Throughout his retirement, admirers would come from far and wide to the Hermitage to pay tribute to the great warrior turned president.
During his presidency, Jackson longed to retire to the Hermitage and leave behind the chaos of political life. But if you know anything about Jackson, you know that this wasn't going to be as easy for him as he thought. Once he was back home, Jackson found himself craving the political action that had defined his life for decades. He would exercise his political influence by inviting figures such as President James Polk, Sam Houston, and others to the Hermitage to work out the political issues of the day.
The irony of Andrew Jackson, of this violent man who both felt and caused so much pain over the course of his life and found himself at death's door on countless occasions, is that he died quite peacefully.
This man had led one of the most extraordinary, unlikely, and consequential lives in all of American history. Many had tried to kill Jackson, from the horrors of the battlefield to the halls of Congress, but none had succeeded. He made many men feel truly represented for the first time, yet terrorized so many others. This man, who had been preceded in death by his mother, his father, and his brothers all before he finished puberty, now at 78 years old, with the scar across his face he had gotten as a child, and the bullet in his chest that had tortured him for half of his life, died quietly in the bedroom of his hermitage, surrounded by his family and his slaves. When you visit the Hermitage, you can see the bed where he passed. They don't let you take pictures inside the home, but it's a truly surreal experience seeing the painting come to life right in front of you. A reminder that this man, for all of his heroism and cruelty, was just a man like any other.
Thank you guys so much for watching. This video has been in the works for a while, so I'm so glad that it finally came together. Thank you also to the patrons who help make this work possible. If you'd like to support, you can do so for as little as $1 a month. You get early access to videos and your name featured in the credits, which I think is pretty cool. I'd love to know what your guys' thoughts on Andrew Jackson are, his complicated legacy, and the ways in which he changed the presidency. I've been focusing a lot this year on frontier America and the evolution of the image of this country, and I feel like he's such a unique figure in that respect. Also, a huge thank you to Ryan Geddie for being part of this video. Ryan's channel is awesome. You should 100% check it out if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next time.